we have to recognize we can set metrics, we can put all of the tools in place, but it's up to each and every one of us, right? So very simply, every meeting we start with a topic around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Welcome to the fourth episode of The Diversity Imperative, a podcast dedicated to unearthing the agriculture sector's potential. We'll talk with diverse voices and industry leaders to motivate listeners to take their organizations, whether it's the family farm or a life science company, to the next level when it comes to stewarding their most important resource, people. My name is Hannah Conchu, and I'm a grain farmer from Cluny, Alberta.
And I'm Erin Hannah, and I lead a national grower association in the nation's capital. Our goal each episode will be to dig into some great conversations that go beyond 280 characters and that seek to inspire a broader dialogue engaging all people in our sector, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or ability. Through rich and candid conversations which consider a variety of perspectives, we look forward to exploring ways to overcome barriers and make diversity and inclusion a topic that everyone is comfortable talking about.
Hey Erin, I'm so pumped to share this episode with our listeners. And don't get me wrong, I'm excited about every episode and every conversation we get to have. But in the conversations we're about to share today, we get down to the good stuff with our guests when it comes to how organizations can lead the way towards building an inclusive culture.
I know. These conversations left me feeling particularly inspired. They're both very rich examples of how two very different organizations, I mean, one is a corporation, the other is a producer association, but how they're both working to ensure that their teams are more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I think equally important, how they've built accountability into the process. So yes, we have two great conversations to share with you today. It's two for the price of one.
So first, we'll start off in the cattle sector with Joe Dickenson. Joe is a birth-to-beef farmer from Oil Springs, Ontario, and he's also a director with Beef Farmers of Ontario. So he'll talk to us about BFO's recent statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how they plan to bring that statement to life. So this was a really key, thoughtful, and intentional first step, you could say, that BFO took as an organization to begin their journey of holding themselves accountable when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. And then we were joined by Chantelle Donahue, who is the Vice President and Commercial Leader for Global Edible Oil Solutions North America for Cargill. And Chantelle, many of you know, is an industry leader committed to ensuring that Canada is at the forefront of a thriving agri-food sector. In 2019, I was there. Chantelle was inducted into the Saskatchewan Agriculture Hall of Fame and is currently the chair of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And along with her husband, Greg, Chantelle operates a grain farm in Biggar, Saskatchewan, and she's the proud mama of her two daughters, Abby and Sally. Now, Cargill has been working to build an inclusive company culture for some time. You know, they're a great example of what a company that is further along in its journey is doing. You know, but to use Chantelle's words, Hannah, it's important to meet people and organizations where they are in this work and to begin the conversation from that point.
Absolutely. She made such a good point about that. So you and I have also gained some new language around this, a new framework to think about how agriculture organizations, or any organization really, a new framework to how they can tackle this work.
Yeah, we did. And I think it's really helpful to talk about this before we get into these great conversations with Joe and Chantelle.
So when we talk about accountability, a key part of this is setting your intention and getting clear about where you want to go. We heard this from Joe in the way that BFO made public their values and their commitment to learning, and with Cargill, how they make sure that their actions are aligned with their core values in the way that they take action on this as a company.
Yeah, and Chantelle shares with us some of the ways that Cargill does this as a company and how they measure and track, and they've experienced some pretty significant success.
They have, and it'll be great to have to hear Chantelle share those numbers. So when it comes to a holistic approach to creating an inclusive company culture, these words on paper, the values, the goals, and the metrics that you set, they can be thought of as the quantitative or the transactional side of doing this work. So this is really key, but it can't be the whole story or the only actions that you take.
The real transformational change comes from lifting those words off the paper and bringing them into your organizational culture. For example, Chantelle references that her and her team have diversity and inclusion on the agenda at every meeting, regardless of the topic. And I love that she encourages them to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
That's so good. I love that. So in our conversation with Joe, he shared a personal story of how he, in real life, witnessed a friend experience racism when they were at a farm conference in the United States. So this informed the importance of the work that he wanted to help lead at BFO. So we can think of these examples as transformational change, the stories and the conversations that change people, or the qualitative ways that people in organizations can grow when it comes to creating an inclusive culture.
Yeah, it's the person-to-person work that results in the real change.
It really is. So the learning that we did comes from a couple of great conversations between Aiko, Bethea, and Brené Brown on the Dare to Lead podcast. Let's link to those resources that help shape our framing on this.
Yeah, we'll post them to the episode 4 tab on our website. All right, let's get into it. We'll start our conversation with Joe Dickenson. We hope you enjoy.
Today we are joined by Joe Dickenson, a birth-to-beef farmer from Oil Springs, Ontario. He was elected as a feedlot director to the Beef Farmers of Ontario in February of 2020. He has previously been a member of the boards of directors of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, the Canadian Young Farmers Forum, and the Junior Farmers Association of Ontario. And in his spare time, you can find him at the hockey rink and antique tractor shows. Thanks for joining us today, Joe.
Thanks, Hannah and Erin.
As I just mentioned here, Joe, you've been involved in lots of farm organizations. I want to start by asking you why you think it's important to give of your time this way as a primary producer.
I think there's a lot of different reasons. The biggest thing is it helps to amplify your voice a little bit. And if there's something that's important to you, it's definitely a way to get your voice heard on that sort of thing. But there's a lot of benefits that you gain as well, and not just from having your voice out there. There's a lot of development that happens at the board level, and there's opportunities and exposure to things that you never would have thought of otherwise. With junior farmers, for example, I never would have had the leadership development in any other thing than I did with junior farmers. I had the opportunity to meet with agricultural leaders as somebody in my early and mid 20s, which I think a lot of people definitely wouldn't have had that experience. And then when you have the opportunity to be involved in broader groups like the OFA or the CYFF, you're able to talk with farmers and farm leaders from across the country and understand agriculture at a much broader level that you never would have had the chance to if you just stayed at home.
Yeah, I think for me at least, it's the role that I have. It's a volunteer role, but at the same time, just like you talk about with professional development, that's been just as important as the work that you do, because you get to do the behind the scenes work and learn from all sorts of people. So it's definitely a really important give and take. So how did you end up serving on the board of directors of BFO? What was your motivation there?
I'd spent 6 years on the OFA board and I really enjoyed it, but the time had come for me to move on, and I was kind of getting the itch to be back involved in policy development and lobbying and the agricultural side of things. And I felt that the right fit for me would be with a commodity board. And since I view myself very much primarily as a beef producer rather than as a crop farmer, being with the BFO was definitely the right fit for me. And the right opportunity for me to step onto the board was as a feedlot director. Even though I don't necessarily have a very large feedlot, there's a lot of people who do their own finishing and who do direct sales in Ontario, and that's not always recognized because people feel that you have to be the big operator on these boards, and we have to make sure that voices are being heard from all parts of the industry.
For sure, that's right, because I'm sure your members are all sorts of types of operations, so that's really good. So I know that BFO recently had their AGM. How did that go?
It went really well. We were able to learn from other organizations doing the virtual AGM, and so we took some of that experience, and we were able to work that into ours. The thing we did with our elections, with the exception of the CCA directors, or the Canadian Cattlemen's Association directors, was that we did our votes ahead of time on directors and our subcommittees. And so that kind of helped move the meeting along a little bit quicker than if we had tried to do that all at once. We also broke it up into 2 days, which helped keep the meeting going. And obviously we weren't going to have the number of speakers that we would have had with an in-person meeting, but we were still able to make it very informative. We were able to keep it flowing so people didn't feel like they were being inconvenienced at all. And it was a very, very dense agenda. Yep.
Yeah, I imagine that running your AGMs, just like everyone's been doing during this time, during the COVID time, you have to sort of pivot. So I'm sure you had to adapt that way. But I wanted to ask you about your elections. Was there anything new and exciting there? Who's on your board and who stepped off?
So we did have one director who left for personal reasons. And so we had a 1-year term. Normally our directors are elected on a 3-year term. So we brought in one new director. Her name's Kim Jo Bliss from Northwestern Ontario. And she's a cow-calf director, but she's come on as a director at large. She's going to bring a really different perspective because things in her corner of the province are quite different than, say, for example, me in Southwestern Ontario.
So, Joe, recently the Beef Farmers of Ontario released a pretty fulsome and specific diversity, equity, and inclusion statement that's received considerable attention, and for good reason. This sort of commitment from ag associations is something that we're seeing slowly start to develop, but this was one of the first, if not the first, bold public statement to come from a commodity association. Part of the statement reads, "We recognize that we are not always a diverse industry, but we believe in fighting racism and discrimination in all its forms." And it goes on to say that the Ontario beef industry will be an ally against discrimination based on race, sexual orientation, gender, religion, and ability, as well as linguistic discrimination. And we're going to link to this statement on our website because I'm sure listeners will want to read it in its entirety. What motivated this work? And why, Joe, did the Beef Farmers of Ontario feel the need to champion this particular effort?
What got it going was in the wake of the George Floyd situation, a number of people were posting their experiences where they realized how privileged they were. And I was one of the ones who did that on social media. I'd been at a conference through CYFF down to Nebraska where it was farmers from North, South, and Central America. And we were doing leadership development. And at the end of the day, we wanted to go out for drinks. And the vast majority of the attendees were Black. For the most part, the majority of the white people were Canadians. And so we went out to a bar and we thought nothing of it. We'd been at the bar the night before and they invited us. We were invited by some of the people there to come back. So we went. There was myself, my buddy Justin from Nova Scotia, my friend Dion from the Bahamas, Tony from Dominica, and I can't remember where the other Justin was from, but because this was 2012, but there was about 5 or 6 of us. There was 2 white guys and 4 black guys, and we went up to the bouncer and went to go in. He asked for ID. I showed him my Ontario ID and had to help him find the birth date and everything else on it. And Justin from Nova Scotia was next, and he did the same thing. And then one of the other guys showed theirs. I think it was Tony. And the guy said, "Do you got a passport on you?" He goes, "No." "Why do I need a passport?" "Well, we don't accept out-of-state licenses." Now, I just said Justin and I showed our provincial licenses. So we confronted him, and he said, "Well, it's different." We knew there was only one thing different, and that was the color of our skin. So we called up our friends that were at another bar, and we went over there, and we had a great night. And we really, for me, that was a real wake-up call. So I posted this to social media, and Jordan Miller, who's another director, asked for my number and gave me a call and said, "I think we should do a statement from BFO." And I said, yeah, I think that could work. Jordan had been on the board for a couple of years, so he was a little more comfortable bringing it up. But once we talked about bringing it up, we realized that we had to be very, very careful that it wasn't a self-serving document. We didn't want it to be a, "Hey, look at me" sort of thing. When we put out a statement of support, we wanted it to be about support and not about us. And we might have been the first commodity organization, but there were a couple other agricultural associations that had put something out ahead of us. In the wake of the protests, 4-H Canada had put one out that was very, very good, very clear, very simple. And the National Farmers Union had also put out one that was very, very broad and very inclusive. And I want to make sure that they get some credit for what they had done, because for them to put what they put out in the time frame that they did says that was on their books ahead of everything happening here. Ours was more of a in response and realizing that we had to do more. They had come to that realization before us, and I do give them a lot of credit for that foresight.
Thanks, Joe, for sharing that story with us. That obviously informed the way in which you approached these circumstances, yourself and Jordan. But tell me a bit more about what it was like to have this conversation at the board table, at the management level. You know, was it smooth sailing? Were there some tough spots that collectively you had to work through in order to get to this finished and very public statement? What was that process like?
So we brought it up at our either June or July meeting. Guess it was the July meeting, and Jordan was the one who presented it, and we actually had pretty good buy-in from most of the board directors right at the start. Jordan had spoke to some of the staff ahead of time, and the staff were all in. So we had a lot of buy-in right from the start. There, from the board, there was nobody who had any major reservations. some may have wondered if we really needed to do anything, but there wasn't, it was a unanimous approval, and it really wasn't a long discussion. So once we got the board on side, we formed a subcommittee with Jordan, myself, Craig McLaughlin, who's another board director, and then we had staff of Catherine Fox and Jennifer Kyle, and we had a teleconference to discuss how we were going to move forward, what the statement was going to look like, and how things were going to go. The staff are the ones who drew up the policy as it is, and they did an amazing job. I am so proud of the work that they did, and I'm really happy that we had the people we did doing the work that they did to make that come about. I know after Jordan brought this up, our president, Rob Lipsett, did some reading himself, and he has become a very vocal ally as well. And you know, our board is in favor, and our board is fully supportive. Don't let me get this wrong, but Rob took a lot of phone calls when we announced it to our advisory council, and he was very staunchly in favor, even before those calls. And when he did get the odd question call, that just made him even more in support. And Richard Horn, our executive director, has been in support of this from day one as well. So it's not just from the grassroots of the board and from the staff, it's at the top end as well. This goes right through our organization. At the top level, we have support for this.
It's a really great statement. It's excuse me, it's thorough and it's really great. But I think what you've just spoken about in terms of your entire organization buying in, from the directors to staff, that's what makes it more powerful. It's because there's clearly, you know, everyone threw their support behind it. So we wanted to specifically talk to you today about accountability, Joe. So we were wondering, is the way that BFO put this out publicly and shared it, and we're very proud of it on your website and on social media, was that sort of part of the accountability piece that you were then saying to everyone, this is what we're doing, and here, take a read?
Yeah, there's definitely an accountability factor to this. If all we had done was do the statement and just tuck it away in the back corner on the internet, nobody would have seen it. And the reality is, what's the point of having something like this, something we've put time and resources into, if we're not willing to stand behind it, and if we're not willing to have people know that it's out there? Again, we want to be very careful that the message is what's conveyed, and that it's not just it's not about us, so to speak. But at the same time, we have to make sure that it's out there so that people can actually hold us to account, and so that we can continue to move forward in these discussions. Ideally, this is just going to be one of many down the road, and I look forward to seeing more statements like this from other organizations.
So going public serves as a form of creating accountability, if you will, but also maybe inspiring others to consider their path.
Well, absolutely, and we know that it has in a couple instances where we've seen messages of support from other organizations saying, we're working on one, but we stand fully behind you guys, and we think this is this is a really good step in the right direction. And the biggest thing is, now that this is out there, now we have to practice it. And that's going to be putting the statement out's the easy part. Now we have to live it. And thankfully, we've got the buy-in that we will be able to do that.
Joe, your statement goes on to recognize the diversity both in the value chain and within your customer base. Why do you think it was important to include that?
Well, the reality is, when you're dealing with any product, the producers are only a small portion of that product. My beef would not get to my customers if it wasn't going through a processing chain. My customers would not be buying it if they weren't my customers. And the fact of the matter is, we're all part of the value chain. And even though, as the statement says, there's maybe not a lot of diversity at the producer side of things, there is a ton of diversity in the beef value chain. And it's important for us to recognize that. Another important part of your statement is a commitment to the fact that this is a process, a journey. And you just alluded to that. You said, putting the words on the paper. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's easy, because I think we've seen now more recently, even with some groups, this is a real struggle to find consensus. But what can you share with us, perhaps, some ways that you think BFO is going to begin to put some of what you have here on paper into action? Well, I think for starters, we're going to have more conversations with groups that don't necessarily look like us, whether it's people within the First Nations communities, because there are some large agricultural areas within them. When we're talking about our Beef North program, which includes opening more of Northern Ontario into beef production, there's going to be times where there's going to be areas where we might come up beside First Nations communities. We want to make sure we're not stepping on any toes. We have chefs and that come from different backgrounds. We need to be able to speak with them and find out what they need from us. We need to look at religious communities and ensure that they can actually get what they're eating and what they need for religious purposes or dietary purposes or what have you. And then at the same time, we also have to make sure that we can communicate with our members. And so we're trying to figure that out right now, so that we can be more communicative with our French members. Because as of right now, everything we do is coming out in English, and we have to make sure that they can speak with us too. So those are all things that that'll be steps, and some things, honestly, we have no idea what those steps are going to be. The only way we're going to find out is by having those conversations and figuring out what we can do and how we can work together. It sounds to me, Joe, like inclusion, like making sure everyone is a part of that conversation from the very beginning is really important to BFO. Absolutely. And a friend of mine with another organization, the Grain Farmers of Ontario, he made a comment. He said, at some point in agriculture, we have to understand that diversity is a lot bigger than just male and female. And yeah, I'll give Brendan full props on that comment, because I never would have come up with the words that he did there. But and we talk about our pastures. We talk about how if we have more diversity within our pastures grow healthier and they can raise better animals and they can do so much more for the environment. It's the same with society. If if we can be more diverse, we can actually contribute more to society as well.
I love that analogy, and it reminds me of the analogy that Jesse Went used when he was the guest on the Canadian Center for Food Integrity webinar. He was talking about the forest, and he worked it in so many times, and it was perfect. You know, like forests are not just one tree. So
Yeah,
love that.
and Jesse's analogy was perfect. It really was. Obviously, we might have to tweak it a little bit here and there for our purposes, but we want a diverse forest. We want a diverse grassland. We need diversity in order to succeed in pretty much anything that we do. And yeah, that includes people.
For sure. And when you talked about your colleagues saying that this conversation is a lot more than gender, that's a huge part of what Erin and I are endeavoring to do with this podcast, because that's what our experience is. But we know that if we're really going to embrace that word diversity, that the conversation goes well beyond that. So we just hope that the agriculture sector is here for that too. So we want to get your take on a discussion that's underway with the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association in terms of the conversation that they're having about potentially transitioning to a more inclusive gender neutral name. So this came up at their recent AGM. And I know that BFO has been around for a long time, and a lot of this might have happened before you joined the board, but we're aware that BFO has changed their name since their inception. So we wanted to just ask you about that. What was that all about, and what was the history there for BFO?
Yeah, so I actually had to reach out to staff to get a little bit of the timeline. I do recall the name change. We went from being the Ontario Cattlemen's Association to the Beef Farmers of Ontario in 2013. And there was an internal plan to try and be a little more clear with our marketing and a little more inclusive with our name and that sort of stuff. But the other thing was to be more clear to our customers and the government and everybody else that we're lobbying with. Because honestly, what is a cattleman? And so we looked at the other organizations that were out there. This was a few years after the Ontario Milk Marketing Board had changed its name to the Dairy Farmers of Ontario. The three main cash crop organizations had just merged together to become the Grain Farmers of Ontario. And so we wanted to kind of align with how the other organizations had named themselves, so that we were out there and we were clear as to what we were. And saying that we're the Beef Farmers of Ontario is pretty simple wording.
It is. I mean, it's all encompassing and it's inclusive. And I want to pick up on what you said about, you're talking about the people that you lobby as well as your customers. It's not only about the people that you represent.
Yeah, that's right. Like our job as BFO is to kind of be the public face of beef farmers in Ontario. So not only do we represent 19,000 beef farmers in the province, we also are taking their message to government, and we're doing the best we can to market across the province as well. And so when we do that sort of stuff, we have to be clear on who we are, and they have to understand who we are. And it's a lot simpler if we're using terms that are inclusive, that are clear, that are concise.
Really good. Well, it's nice to get that perspective from you, Joe, and I'm sure other people will be interested as they're involved in their own conversations in other provinces. So we want to thank you for your time today and for your candor, Joe, and we want to congratulate you and BFO for the work that you've done to be a leader in this space. And we want to keep in touch and keep up to date with all the work that you're doing.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Chantelle.
Thanks for having me, Erin. It's my pleasure. And Hannah.
So, Chantelle, you and I had an opportunity to catch up just last week, and I was really impressed with some of the internal initiatives that Cargill has underway currently to encourage diversity and inclusion in the organization. Can you familiarize our listeners with some of what's been happening at Cargill in this space?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll try and kind of level set the discussion to start. So when we think about Cargill, our values at the core are doing the right thing and putting people first. And that means all of our people. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion are all critical focus areas at Cargill, but they're not the same. They have distinct meanings. I just want to go through that a little bit because I think it's really important. If we look at diversity, it focuses on representation. But equity helps us to ensure everyone has access to opportunity. And importantly, inclusion ensures everyone feels welcomed, valued, and heard. So the other thing that we recognize is that not everyone starts at the same place. So our goal is to remove barriers that may impact a person's success. When some members of the organization's workforce face barriers to their success and others do not, then equal treatment does not lead to true equity. So for fair treatment to be equitable treatment, the first step is to make adjustments so that everybody has the opportunity to succeed. So that there is a nuance there, and that is different from treating everyone the same. So you asked, what are some of the things we're doing? So I'll share some of those things, but I really wanted to share the perspective of how we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So some of the things we're doing, if we look at recruitment and hiring, one of the things we found is making sure that we are debiasing our job descriptions to make them more inclusive. So we've done that on over 1,000 job descriptions. The result of that is that we are actually finding we are getting many more women applicants, and a majority of the positions are going to women as opposed to 26% only before we did this debiasing. We also have an inclusive hiring program. And this is a really neat piece, and I think we can really challenge ourselves, is making sure that we have diverse hiring panels to minimize the bias that's coming forward in the hiring process. I've recently been a part of some of these, and we're really challenging ourselves, but seeing the results and probably some different outcomes than we would have historically seen. We also require our hiring managers to do unconscious bias training. Now, as it relates, if we think about succession and promotion and talent development, an inclusive leadership factor is added for all of that succession planning to make sure that that our leaders of today and our leaders of the future demonstrate inclusive leadership. It's also about building capabilities, right? Having the learning and professional development and training available to any and all employees. And then ultimately leadership accountability. So we have goals starting at the top for our leaders and cascaded through the organization, and holding ourselves accountable for progress as it relates to that. We also have, from our executive team, we have what we would refer to as business resource groups to help on those journeys. That would include, Cargill Women's Network, Cargill's Young Professionals, Cargill's Hispanic Latino Council. We have our executive team members tagged to these groups that are really focused on engaging employees in inclusion. So these are some of the improvements. Personally, when I look at the Cargill I started with 20 years ago, even the Cargill of 10 years ago, we continue to make improvements, and we've made really significant improvements, I would say, really over the last 5 to 10 years, but there's still a lot of work to do yet.
Wow, Chantelle, there's so much going on there that Cargill's doing. It's so nice to hear about all that. I first want to thank you for defining those terms for us, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's something Erin and I have commented on, that's not something that we have discreetly defined yet. And I think when in all the organizational work that we do, we sometimes are using those terms and not fully understanding their meaning of what they're talking about. So I think that is the first key step, is everybody on the same page and using those terms the way that they should be used. So another, a really helpful framing that Erin and I have been discussing in terms of organizational work is sort of the quantitative way of looking at your diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And you touched on a lot of that. So the job descriptions, making sure there's no bias in how those are put forward into the world in your hiring panels. And you gave a number there, so that's really great. I'm curious if there are other ways that you are doing, that you're using targets and you're making measurements. Are there other things that you're tracking on more of the sort of qualitative side of things? Or sorry, on the quantitative.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so it's interesting. I remember several years ago when I saw the first targets that came out, and I was one of those targets, right? It was to from a gender perspective, right? To increase, women that we have in senior leadership roles, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that, right? So it's been a very interesting journey for me, but I'll tell you what, when you can measure it and you can hold yourself accountable to it. And I think that is really important. So whether we're comfortable, like I shared with you personally, where my starting point was, I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to be part of that metric. I just want to keep on going and doing my job. The recognition that as we can measure these, we can drive accountability. So one thing that I think is really cool is Cargill aspires to have 50% gender parity, 50 by 2030 of females in leadership positions, and 20% minorities in those positions. What we've also done, and this is a tall feat, right? This is, as you can tell, and we look at the world around us, we're making advancements, but this is a big goal to achieve. One of the things that we've also done to help enable that is that we've set up regional diversity. We're standing up regional diversity councils, right? So this isn't a one size fits all, right? It is going to be different. Just like in Canada, it's going to be different in whatever sector you're in, or even in agriculture, if you specifically go, whether you're in bigger Saskatchewan like I am, or if you're, in across the country, right? But these regional diversity councils for around the world that will help us to identify the diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities for that particular part of the world, recognizing that they won't all be the same, but then they will put in place the metrics and the action plans that will have the greatest impact in those regions. So we've taken it from, here are some general metrics, creating that culture, and then making advancements on those, and then saying, okay, if we're really going to get to where we believe we need to go, we're going to have to add yet another layer in, right? Which are these regional councils, which will have the priorities and metrics that are relevant to those regions. So, and I think the other thing is, and this is the other thing we need to, from my perspective, from a Cargill perspective, Cargill doesn't make hiring or any other employment rate related decisions on the basis of race, gender, or any other protected characteristic, but there is a clear mission to increase women in leadership positions globally, as well as minorities, right? And to do that, it means that we're pulling all of the levers around starting with recruiting, redoubling our efforts to build inclusive work environments and therefore increase our retention, and then make sure that we're focusing our intention as well on the career development for that talent, and making sure that, and I shared with you, from the accountability we have for, are they an inclusive, are we bringing inclusive leaders, right? So continuing to do that as well. So it's a holistic approach.
So it sounds like you're targeting the targets, which I love. So you've got that overarching target of gender parity, and then thinking about sort of it in a regionally specific way. So I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to ask you about sort of the what Erin and I have been discussing is sort of the transformational change. So we have this accountability that you set with these targets that you use and that you track and that you measure against. But what are some of the ways that you think that, say, you and the teams that you work with, what are the ways that you bring this conversation sort of to life in terms of culture? So how is it talked about with your staff and with your teams? Like, what are the ways that it sort of comes to life?
Yeah, so I think, so first and foremost, where does that start, right? There is a direction at the top with the CEO clearly setting the tune, right? So we are creating that culture, and this is one of what his lasting, he wants his lasting legacies to be, which is exceptionally impressive. We have to recognize we can set metrics, we can put all of the tools in place, but it's up to each and every one of us, right? So very simply, every meeting we start with a topic around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Kind of a contact moment around that. In a lot of our meetings, it's part of the conversation, right? We do a lot of training. We share that, right? My entire team has gone through unconscious bias training, and we learned a lot about ourselves as we went through that, because it's not just about the metric, it's about how comfortable are we? Are we comfortable in these conversations? Are we creating that inclusive environment and really educating ourselves on this journey about what we know and what we don't know, and where we can improve, and creating an environment where it's okay, right? And if you're not, and I think the other thing to note is not everyone is at the same point in this journey, and we need to respect that, right? But what's important is that we all get on the journey and can keep ourselves, I say to my team always, let's keep ourselves comfortably uncomfortable in this with an open mind. And I think that's what's really starting to drive this it's tone at the top. It's the metrics, it's the tools, but it's how are we making it part of our everyday.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation with you, because what you just said, get on the journey. It's like, let's pull up to the table. We're doing this together, right? And everyone's, at a different point. So I love that so much. So you've talked about how you're making it part of your culture, discussing it often, trying to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So is there a role for all the different staff that work at Cargill, from the, using the hierarchical method from the top to the bottom? Or do you find that it's something that is more encapsulated by what the leaders do?
Well, I mean, clearly the leadership, the tone getting set at the top then enables everything else. And I think that what you'll see with Cargill is that we all own it. We all own the business strategy. Everybody has a role, right? And when I talked about some of the BRG groups that we have, right? Everyone can participate in those. Everyone, I have great examples of folks that are really, really passionate in this area. They're just coming up, and they drive the progress. They drive the discussions that we're having, right? Because they have a passion and a level of comfort. I think ultimately, if everyone has a role in creating that inclusive culture so that we can bring our whole selves to work. And if we don't, are we there yet? I think we're a heck of a lot further than we were a year ago. Right. But we're in a very positive trajectory in this journey.
Chantelle, why is this work important to Cargill? What does the company seek to gain by doing this?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we just have to go back to the core values, right? So putting people first, all people first, and doing the right thing, right? That's the core of our foundation. But we also need to recognize that clearly, if we put employees first, They're going to put our customers and their coworkers first. And that's how we continue to be successful in our purpose, right? And that purpose at a high level being, to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way.
And do you think it's fair to say that it's a competitive advantage for Cargill if you think about that? Maybe not all companies are as invested in this work along with what their core functions are? I
think so. You hear me say all the time, everybody's on a different spot in this journey, right? And I think that all companies should be on their own journeys in the space. But I also do believe that doing nothing is not an option. And each company should really find goals that are authentic to it, and they need to be achievable, relative to their stakeholders, and responsive to the environment that we're in right now. And sometimes you have to pivot quickly, right? We think about COVID and everything we've had to do around that. But we know why Cargill's on it. I know personally why I align. I can do all the things I do, right? Have our farm at home and work, give my all to Cargill because we align on those values. And I think, if we can all get there, then we're all much, much better together. And I think the agri-food system, if we even think about the Canadian agri-food system, right? We're better together, and we're better the sooner we can come together on this.
I think the reason, and I appreciate your answer there, and I agree. And I think part of the reason that, or what inspired this question for Hannah and I, if you will, Chantelle, is we think about the conversations that her and I have had too about where we'll go in our journey, whether it's, a commitment to sit on a board or to volunteer with an association or our next career move, if you will. And so to what extent, especially in light of everything that's happening in the world these days, to what extent are employees increasingly going to be looking at these organizations and what they're doing in this space when they consider where they want to spend their time?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And just as you were talking there, I have to tell you, one of the neatest things I've observed, the amount of new fathers in our organization that are taking time to spend with their newborns, that are taking leave, and the company that's enabling it. So, I've often thought about it as, 20 years ago was a little trickier being a female working in the space that I was working in, and you maneuvered through it. But then I also think of the flip of it, right? And now, as we think about to being as inclusive as possible, the silver lining on this is things like that, right? It's okay for fathers to take a paid leave to spend time with their newborns. How amazing, right? That definitely wasn't happening, 5, 10, or 20 years ago, to the extent anyways that it is now. So I think that's the other piece is about, this holistic inclusion. There's a lot of things that are happening that wouldn't historically have. Sorry, I digress there, but you really,
Well, and I agree with you on that point, because you made me think about, my husband and myself having this conversation with our first child, which would have been 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And the conversation we had more recently with our second, which was 5 years ago. And the conversation we had with our first 15 years ago was a significant amount of reluctance on his part to consider what level of acceptance would exist in his workplace if he wanted to take that leave. We didn't have the same conversation 5 years ago with our daughter, right? And he took significantly more time because culturally we're seeing that shift, greater acceptance. And that's working for everyone, for men, for women. It's a welcome shift. So thanks for flagging that. Maybe with our final question, I want to shift gears for a moment. Chantelle, you've spent your entire career in the ag sector and are broadly recognized as a leader, not just in your work with Cargill, but in the various boards and councils where you've served. What's the compelling reason for change in Canada's agriculture sector? Why does this issue have to matter to everybody?
Yeah. So I think, simply put, we're better together. We're better as an industry and environment where we can all feel included and bring our whole selves to this industry that we touch. And if we can do this, then we'll continue to succeed in advancing the Canadian agri-food sector in a very meaningful way. I mean, and the two of you know me well enough to know that the success of the Canadian agri-food industry is my absolute number one passion from that perspective. And I think the other thing is what we have to recognize is, when I reflect on my 20 years in the industry, I see that we have come a very long way, but recognizing that it's a journey and there is still work to be done. And what I really think is very important is that we make sure that as we're trying to be more diverse and equitable, is that we continue to be totally inclusive, right? That everyone can feel welcome, valued, and heard. And I think what is also important to recognize, and I alluded to it earlier, but I'll say it again, that across the country, within all the various sectors and along the value chain, we are going to be at different levels of comfort in this journey. And that the best way to continue to move along is we need to respect that and move at the pace, as I say, where we're comfortably uncomfortable, but recognizing we need to continue to make progress as well. I know from Cargill, a company that's very focused on its people and results, we've put metrics in place, and we do see the value of that and the improvement that we're making in that place.
Thank you, Chantelle, for joining Hannah and I to tell us a bit about what's going on at Cargill, these excellent initiatives, and to share some of your personal perspective on this issue. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity.
And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in to the 4th episode of The Diversity Imperative. Hannah and I look forward to our next conversation in a few weeks' time. Until then, the conversation continues on Twitter at Diversity in Ag or on Facebook and Instagram at Diversity Imperative.